So in your photography, have you ever wanted to know exactly where a shadow from a building or some other object would fall on a particular day? Or did you know that knowing an object's shadow location gives you a super easy way to line it up with the moon or the sun? Well, the Shadow tool in Planit Pro gives you the way to do all of this easily and with pinpoint accuracy. Hey everyone, this is Mike Shaw with Planit Pro here to show you how to use the Shadow tool in the Light and Shadow page. You access the Shadow tool by first dragging down from the title bar like this, and then you choose the Light and Shadow tool right here. It's the last one under the Special Interest category, and there are two separate features that are actually mingled together. They're the Shadow feature, which is shown on the first row, and the Light feature, which is shown on the second row. And in this video tutorial, we're going to talk about the Shadow feature here, and we'll have a separate one to talk about the Light feature. So to choose the light source that produces the shadow, first of all, tap the first button on the first row like this, and this will bring up a couple of options: auto, sun, and moon. Now, if you choose auto, it means the app will automatically select the strongest light source at the time. And depending on the time of day, this could be either the sun or the moon. Just depends on which is above the horizon or is the more powerful. And obviously, if the sun's above the horizon, that's the one that's always going to be selected. But if the sun is down and the moon is up, then the app's going to use the moon as the main light source. And since neither is really up and dominant during twilight, there's no dominant light source above the horizon, so that during twilight, the app selects neither. But in some special cases that you'll see in a minute, you might want to force the light source to be the sun or the moon, and you can always select those options here. And we'll show you why this could be useful in a few different cases, but for now we're just going to keep it here set to auto. Now the second value is the elevation angle of the selected light source, or the height of the light source above the horizon. Now, as you can see, as the current time is set to be during twilight, no information is displayed, since, as I mentioned earlier, there really aren't any shadows during twilight. But now, look what happens if we adjust the time to daytime like this. And what you can see is, since the sun is now above the horizon, you'll see an angle displayed right here. And this number represents the elevation angle of the sun above the horizon in degrees. Now the next field is the subject height. So in this demonstration, what we're going to do is we're going to use the Oriental Pearl TV tower as an example, which you can see right here on the map. And so what we'll do is we'll tap right here to set the height of the tower to 468 meters like this. And once we do that, now you can see that there's a dark black line on the map. And this line represents the shadow of the Oriental Pearl TV tower when the sun is at this particular elevation angle. And now look what happens when I adjust the time. You can see that the shadow moves along with it. Both the direction and the length of the shadow will change with the time. And this is totally understandable as the building shadow comes from the sun. The lower the sun, the longer the shadow length, and the higher the sun, the shorter the shadow length, just like what you'd expect. And notice up here, you can see the subject height, which is what we just set, as well as the shadow length, which is shown right here, right next to it. All right, so now let's find a day that has the moon. For example, a quarter moon right just here. Now, during the day, the shadow is still caused by the sun, and that's because even though the moon is also up, the dominant light source is still the sun. And since we selected auto, the sun is used as the selected light source. But notice how I can tap right just here to force the light source to be from the moon. And when we do that, now you'll see that the shadow is caused by the moon on the map instead of the shadow caused by the sun. And of course, you can go back and force the light source to be from the sun as well by choosing that right just here. And as you can see, at this moment in time, the shadow is no different than the one that we resulted from when we selected auto. So we're just going to go back to the auto selection mode, and now we're going to adjust the time to be twilight. And when we do that, no shadow is shown. But now let's continue to advance the time like this, so that as it gets darker, the moon becomes the dominant light source, and then the moon is used automatically to calculate the direction and the length of the shadow. And now notice that the shadow on the map has changed from the shadow caused by the sun, as well as the icon up here has also changed to the moon icon. You may have noticed earlier during the day that the sun was the icon up here, and now that it's night, the moon is the icon displayed. And before we continue, let me show you one other way, a different way to set the subject height. So first we're going to clear the subject height right here. And next we're going to add a marker, set it to be a building, and set the height of the building to be the TV tower to be 468 meters and the width to be 50 meters like this. And done. Now, after I add a scene location pin to the marker like this, even though we haven't set the subject height like we did before, the app draws in the shadow automatically, just like you can see right here. And this is because what the app does is it automatically draws in shadows for any markers that are buildings with heights. So keep in mind though, we only draw in the shadows for the building markers, but you can add a lot of these building markers on the map and their shadows will be drawn for all of them. So finally, let me show you one more photography opportunity that makes the shadow tool so very useful. Now, while the original purpose of the shadow tool is to find out if an area gets covered up by the shadow of a building, it can also help for certain sun and moon alignment shots. Let me show you what I mean. So first, let's adjust the time so that the sun is just rising like right now. And what you can see is the entire shadow right along here. Well, how can this help us for an alignment shot? Well, as we plan the location for these type of photographs where we align the sun or the moon with a particular building, let's say, often the most difficult and time-consuming step is to find the possible camera locations on the map where the sun and the moon is aligned with the top of the subject. Generally speaking, you have to pick a location, check the viewfinder to see if it's in alignment, then go back to see if the location is available and not blocked by any of the surrounding terrain or other buildings. And sometimes this process means we need to go back and adjust the time, then the location, and back and forth many times. And that can be quite time-consuming, relatively speaking. Now, instead, just imagine that you're standing right here at the tip of the shadow. What would you see when you look at the sun? Well, since you're at the tip of the shadow, which is created by the top of the building, you know that at that spot and at that time, the sun is precisely behind the top of the building. In other words, perfect alignment. Boom! Mic drop. Put another way, the shadow ending location is exactly where the sun is blocked by the top of the building. Totally makes sense. So if you take a picture, the sun is going to be perfectly aligned with the building. Now keep in mind, of course, that this is just a rough location since the shadow doesn't consider the elevation change, and it also assumes the building's on a flat ground. Okay, so for now, let's switch over to a satellite map like this to determine if the location is available while adjusting the time just like this. And once we think the location is available, we can long press to set it as a camera location like this. Now we go back and set the building as a scene location like this. And we can always fine-tune the camera location if needed. Then we simply point the camera towards the building by rotating the green fan like this. And then switch over to the VR viewfinder to see it like this. And as you can see, the sun is now perfectly aligned with the building. And we can, of course, further fine-tune the location by switching to a long telephoto lens. If the sun is a little too low or too high, we can adjust the time so that the sun is more or exactly where we want it to be, just like this. Then we can go back to the map to move the camera location a little to get the perfectly aligned composition that we want. And this little trick will allow you to quickly nail down the possible camera locations with absolute precision. All right. Now, the next thing you want to see is why we have this button for forcing the moon to be the light source. And the reason being is you're going to want to use the same trick to get the full moon perfectly aligned with the building instead of the sun. So let's see how to do this. So the first step is to find a full moon night like this. But since we want a moon alignment shot, you can see that the moon is up right here, but, however, the shadow is still from the sun, as the sun is also up. It makes sense because the sun's light overpowers the moonlight in terms of creating the shadow. But for the alignment trick you saw earlier, we need to have the moon shadow. And that's easy. All we need to do now is to go back to the button to force the light source to be the moon, just like you saw before. And now you can see the moon shadow as this long dark line pointing away from the moon, although we may need to adjust the time a little bit like this. And just like before, you can drag the camera location to the ending position of the moon shadow. And you can verify the correct position in the VR viewfinder like this. And as you can see, the moon is perfectly aligned with the building. And of course, you'd have to actually verify the camera location is available, just like before. Now, when you actually plan for this type of shot, you're going to want to check that there's no surrounding terrain or other buildings that are blocking the camera location. This trick also works best if the city location is flat. And that's because this camera location and the building location are at the same elevation. If they're not, then the camera, let's say for example, the camera location is much higher than the building location, then the actual camera location for the alignment would be in front of the calculated shadow ending location. And conversely, if the camera location is lower, then it would have the actual spot would be beyond the shadow location. So both of these would be off by some amount using this method. And not a problem. You just want to make sure you check the alignment using the VR viewfinder to confirm everything. And that's because the VR viewfinder is more accurate since it does take into account the camera and the building elevation separately. All right, so one last point. You can always long press the subject height button like this. And the result of doing that is the same as pressing the scene button over here. And what that does is it finds any building markers around the scene location and automatically sets the subject height to the building marker height. Well, okay, that's the end of this video tutorial. Once again, this is Mike Shaw with Planit Pro saying thanks for watching, and we hope you enjoy planning your shadow projects using the shadow tool in Planit Pro.